One of the growing concerns when it comes to digital security is intellectual property. So in this presentation, we are going to be looking at hacking from the perspective of intellectual property theft. Now, in the previous video, we were discussing who hacks and why, and what everyone should know about hackers. And so I'm not going to be reviewing who our attackers are, but keep in mind that is going to play into this. Because when we talk about hacking intellectual property, there are certain actors in the hacking community that are going to be the bigger threats, and some that are not going to be quite as big of threats. That's not to say that none of them will be. It's just to say that there are going to be bigger threats that we face when we deal with intellectual property. So what we're going to be covering in this presentation here is the who of intellectual property. Who should be concerned? We're going to be covering what is intellectual property and theft of it. We're going to be covering, can we protect intellectual property? I'm also going to be recommending some resources. I'm also going to be talking about why this is a growing challenge and a major myth, actually two major myths about the attacks. And then we're going to look at best practices for physical and digital intellectual property theft prevention. So I believe there's two physical discussions about best practices for prevention and then for digital prevention measures that we can take. So the who should know about this intellectual property. It may not be appropriate for everyone to know what the intellectual property is or how it's protected at a firm. Keep that in mind. When you talk about here's our intellectual property and you highlight that, well, should you be discussing that with employees? So we really want to think about who should actually be involved in this discussion. And the first one is obviously the creator of intellectual property. You can see the hierarchy here. That is definitely a person who knows about the intellectual property. They created it. But actually everybody else listed here may not need to be involved, especially when we're talking about any type of digital environment. So the executives may not need to know. For instance, if the creator of intellectual property is not the CEO or CFO or any of the executives, then the executives may not need to know at all. We'll discuss an example of that in a second. The same thing with security. Security may not need to be involved. They may need to be involved, but they may not need to be involved. And depending on the environment, security might need to be before executives. So it could be that, and then of course it may be specific security staff. Then we have operations here. Operations would be the next one in line that they may or may not need to know. And again, it may be specific members. So you may only want the senior members of the operations. And then finally, developers. And again, this is looking at it from the perspective of a digital environment. If it's a physical environment, it's unlikely that anyone outside the creator of intellectual property needs to know. And there are ways, of course, to get around that. So what is intellectual property? It is a design that is unique and is attributed to an owner or set of owners. So it could be multiple owners, it could be one owner. So for instance, if there was a cure for cancer, that would be intellectual property. That would be very valuable, and we'll see why that would be a target in a second. And even something, though, as simple as the recipe to cupcakes could be intellectual property, if you think about it, right? That's intellectual property that could be very valuable. It could be a very popular cupcake recipe, makes a lot of money. Problem is, anything that makes a lot of money is potentially a target. So going back to this, let's say we're talking about a cupcake recipe. Outside of the creator of the intellectual property, if there is a firm that's selling cupcakes, nobody else actually needs to know what the recipe to the cupcake is. There are ways in which we can design and develop the cupcakes and produce the cupcakes that nobody actually knows what the recipe is, right? So that's an example of something where only one person needs to know, and that would be the creator of the recipe. So why steal intellectual property? Why is this a growing threat? Why are we seeing more of this? Well, in some cases, let's say most cases, production requires significant work, whereas theft may require less work. And unfortunately, anytime there's less work or there's just a situation which favors laziness, people are going to prefer that. So if you steal someone's intellectual property, that may be a way in which you can make money easier than if you actually produce it yourself. And I point here geopolitical competition. Keep in mind the powers of the world right now are shifting, and the United States is as a world power is in decline, whereas China is on the rise. And although there's been a lot of discussions between these two countries, this is just the reality of the world order, right? In the 1800s or the 19th century, it was the British Empire that was the most powerful empire, and then along came the 20th century, where the United States became the world power, and the 21st century, China will be probably the world power. Maybe India. Actually, India might be a bigger world power in the long run than China in the 21st century. We'll see. But when there's geopolitical competition like this, it does relate to credibility. If you think about it, as a case in point, think about U.S. universities. People are willing to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to come to U.S. universities. Why? Well, because the US was the world power in the 20th century. That gave it credibility, right? And so if you become the world power, your universities are going to gain that credibility and you can charge those prices, right? So there's credibility to being the world power. That is one of the reasons why we see intellectual property theft sometimes on the country level. And keep in mind, it's not just China and the United States. For instance, there was a fighter jet that Russia developed that they accused China of copying as well. So, I mean, it can be on other levels. It just typically, if I was trying to look for information on the amount of intellectual property theft, and everything came back with China and the US. So it's very annoying when you try to do research on this topic because that seems to be the topic everybody wants to talk about. However, who ultimately pays for intellectual property theft is the consumer, right? And so this goes back to kind of a story that I experienced. I developed some intellectual property, took about 250 hours of work, and unfortunately it was stolen. And one of the things that it taught me, and it was a bad experience. So for those of you who've gone through this, I totally understand if you've had your work stolen as well. But one of the things that it did teach me was that ultimately what intellectual property theft does is it discourages production. And what that means is that in the long run, it wasn't even me who paid for the intellectual property theft. I mean, I paid some, but ultimately it was going to be the consumer that was going to pay for intellectual property theft, right? And so we have to think about the world that we live in. Would people like the Wright brothers exist if their invention could potentially have been stolen? And that's not really a world that any of us wants to live in. So when you wonder, well, why is it that you're concerned about intellectual property theft, even if it's not your intellectual property? Well, it's because we don't want to live in a world in which people are stealing this, because it's going to, the long-term effect of that is it's going to be a discouragement of production. And so we're going to have less production, and that's going to hurt the consumer in the long run. So in looking for the cost estimation, it appears to be that the cost of intellectual property theft worldwide, so this is the entire world, not just the US, is anywhere from 300 billion to in excess of 1 trillion. It really varies by research. There were some individuals who were claiming the US alone has $500 billion worth of intellectual property theft stolen a year. I think that's kind of absurdly high, but it could be up there. And if that's the case, then more than likely worldwide, we're looking at excess of 1 trillion. But it could be as low as 300 billion, and it does vary by year. Plus the other thing as well, we have to think about, it's hard to quantify intellectual property theft because let's take the cupcake recipe. How much does that cost when that theft occurs? It seems simple, but it could be pretty large for the person who produced that recipe. So it's hard to quantify this. It's not always straightforward to quantify it. So can we protect intellectual property? This is a good question, and as you can see, the image of a nuclear weapon. The reason why I bring this up is because obviously there's many countries that have access to nuclear technology and nuclear weapons now, even though the US was the first one that developed it. Though keep in mind that the US developed nuclear weapons, and a lot of the scientists involved were not actually American scientists. Look at their backgrounds. Some of the scientists, for instance, were Germans. So keep in mind that it wasn't actually Americans that developed nuclear weapons first. It was just that they lived in the United States and they may have become American citizens, but some of the scientists were not Americans. And so that may explain part of the reason why it ended up spreading. But I would actually argue that nuclear weapons are a good example of why intellectual property can be protected, at least for a long period of time. Because while it is true that the Soviet Union and China eventually got access to nuclear weapons, and then of course India and Pakistan, and I believe the British, and then France has access to nuclear weapons. I believe those are the countries, and don't quote me on that. But there's 190 plus countries in the world. You can look that up. The latest figure I saw was 195. Well, even if we assume that 20 countries have access to nuclear weapons, most of which we don't know about if that was the case, I think it's actually less than 10, that's still a fraction of the countries of the world. Right? And so there's a lot of aspects to developing a nuclear weapon that go into developing a nuclear weapon if we think about it. And those are forms of intellectual property. And therefore, countries have done a fairly good job protecting that because, as we see, it's really the powerful countries that have access to nuclear weapons, not the countries that are moderately powerful. The countries that are moderately powerful have really struggled to get access. So I would argue that actually nuclear weapons provide an example of where we can protect intellectual property. Now, we may not be able to protect our intellectual property against very big actors and in terms of the hacking community, and that's why I highlighted the presentation, like who attacks and why. There might be actors in that we're just not going to be able to protect against. But as far as the, let's say, medium and minor competition, the answer is yes, we probably can. And even some of the major competition, depending on who they are. So some of the recommended resources, I'm going to give a little bit of commentary on these and why I recommend them. The first resource I would highly recommend is a book called Unrestricted Warfare. Now, I will caution you, the next two recommendations, including this one, are China versus the US. And what's important with these is that you chew the meat and spit out the bones. Keep in mind the Chinese point of view is one in which they want to be the world power, rightfully so. And the American point of view is they don't want China to be the world power. Again, understandably so. However, there's meat in this material regardless of your viewpoint. So just understand that's the framework that these individuals are coming from. And what I'm more focused on is the strategy in these books, or the strategy in these material, and looking at that from the perspective of cybersecurity, not getting caught up in the minutia of who wants to be the world power this century. So one of the authors, as you can see, was the equivalent to a colonel at the time. I don't know if the People's Liberation Army used the phrase colonel or general, but by the time this right here was written, this U.S. uses its dollar to dominate the world, he was promoted to general. And in the book, he talks about concepts such as information poisoning, or dirtying data, if you would, financial manipulation, cyber attacks involving intellectual property, and of course the use of malware. And another thing about him is he wrote this, and this is free on the internet. I highly suggest all of you read it. But the U.S. uses its dollar to dominate the world. Of course, this was written later after this book. But this shows you his step-by-step strategy. You can see his strategic thinking into how he looks at the world. So if you haven't read this book yet, I would start here so that you can get a preview for how he thinks through problems. But Unrestricted Warfare is one of the best books in terms of strategy, and it does mention things like cyber attacks going after intellectual property, because that is one of the ways in which you can dethrone a world power. You can't, at the time that it was written, keep in mind, I believe the book was written in 98, 99, nobody argued that the U.S. was the world power, right? The U.S. had the best technology on the planet. So China was trying to undermine that. And how do you go about undermining that? That's very difficult if you think about it. And so you are the underdog trying to take on the favorite. And they were able to do that by using some of these concepts. The inverse, of course, to that recommendation, or the opposite of that recommendation, I should say, is this talk on YouTube, and I'm going to be linking these resources in the description, and you can see Unrestricted Warfare on campus. And this highlights intellectual property directly. There's a lot of intellectual property that is developed on college campuses, so you can see why they would be a target. Okay, by the way, notice very few people view stuff like this. Very important. But she talks about some of the principles in Unrestricted Warfare and how they relate to what they would do at a college campus. I will tell you one of the highlights about both the Chinese and the Russian military that I highly admire, and that is the, let's see, here it is, limited objectives and minimal consumption. And these are two very powerful techniques that their militaries use that the U.S. military does not use. And what that means is that they do not expend a lot of resources, unlike the U.S. I hear this a lot in America, and it shows you, by the way, a great example of this principle, which is information poisoning. You'll hear Americans talk about how much they spend on their military. Nobody in the world can contest us because we spend all this money on our military. Well, that's actually misinformation, because actually if you can spend little money and get good results, you're actually more powerful than somebody spending lots of money. So you can see how Americans are actually very deluded in their information, because it's actually the person who spends the least amount of money and gets the best amount of results. And so it's a very interesting talk, but you can see how the opposite side of the Chinese are approaching this challenge. But I will say one of the really good points in this book is the use of very few resources to get very good results. And that's something that I have to give kudos to both the Chinese and the Russian military, because they're phenomenal at spending very little money and getting outstanding results. Another resource I highly recommend is the documentary 0 Days. You can get this on Amazon. Sometimes they have like a bonus with documentaries that you can get them free for a period of time, so you can watch them free. And 0 Days, I'm not sure if that's part of that, but it may be. So just keep that in mind. But this is good for just thinking strategically in general. And there are interviews with military leaders as well as people in the private cybersecurity field. I highly suggest all of them are just dropping bars of gold in terms of knowledge, and could not recommend that more. I do not necessarily agree with the conclusions of the film, but I think the interviews with some of the people in the private and the military, just valuable insights. Of course, there is also the course that I've created on Skillshare, the Consumer Guide to Digital Security. And I have a link in the description. Of course, some of the advantages of this comes from the consumer perspective, but if you're trying to protect intellectual property, some of the techniques would work in that case. If you're a company in general, some of the techniques you should be familiar with. One of the great things about this course is I have full editorial control for time-relevant topics. The reason why that's important, of course, is because in the case of SIM swaps, a story that I like to highlight, when I was writing about SIM swaps initially, a lot of publications did not want to publish anything about them because they had never heard of it. It was brand new, and I was trying to caution people ahead of time to be very careful about it. So the great thing about this course is I no longer have to worry about some editor coming back and saying, well, I've never heard of this. It doesn't matter. I have full editorial control. So even if it is a new hack and it's only happened 5 times in 1 year, but it's very dangerous, you can know about it in advance. In fact, there was a recent update made, and that was going to occur in 1 month, and a month ahead of time I gave students a warning about it. So you've been warned about that for those of you who are in the course. And then, of course, just on the light side, I recommend this video. This is, Russell Peters. He makes a joke about intellectual property. I'm not going to ruin it, so you'll have to watch it, but it is really funny. And if you like to laugh, that's something that you can watch. It'll also be listed in the description. So this video is being recorded during a time of what I refer to as he who cannot be named. So currently comments are temporarily disabled, and I am not using the Premiere feature, which does allow me to chat with my audience while webinars like this are going on. Unfortunately, I'm not using that. And that's just because everybody seems to be talking about he who cannot be named. I did start my career in marketing, especially on the data side, and I can tell you that you should always be careful in marketing about diversions and pendulum swings. So while you might temporarily enjoy the marketing, let's say, bonuses of he who cannot be named, the pendulum swing tends to go back in the other direction, and if you've been leaning on that, you have to be careful. Backlashes are pretty painful. So that's just a very kind way from a marketing perspective of saying that you probably shouldn't be marketing around he who cannot be named. That's a very foolish thing to do. But if you want to do that, that pendulum swing coming back your way is going to be really painful. So, and I've seen that with a lot of companies multiple times. It's not a smart strategy. So that being said, let's discuss some physical intellectual property best practices along with digital after the physical. So the first 2 physical intellectual property best practices are, number 1, never store physical intellectual property digitally if it's not required. And by doing this, let's say you have physical intellectual property. We're going to use the example of a cupcake recipe. If you store that in a computer, you open yourself up to attacks anywhere. Now, of course, some people who are like, we'll talk about air-gapped machines. They'll be like, well, Tim, you know, if my machine is air-gapped, so I store it digitally and nobody can get access to it. Well, you can jump air-gapped networks. And if you don't know about that, then you clearly don't know that much about digital security, because air-gapped networks are not protected. In fact, I highly suggest, if you don't believe me, just watch the film 0 Days. They discuss at least 2 techniques in that film as jumping air-gapped networks. But there are many ways to do it. This has been discussed in the cybersecurity community quite a bit. So as soon as you put physical intellectual property in the digital world, you are now opening yourself up to attacks from anywhere. That's the thing about computers, is you can have somebody from Belarus attack you. You can have somebody from Russia attack you. You can have somebody from China or Thailand or Japan. You open yourself up to attacks anywhere. If you have a cupcake recipe that's, let's say, on a physical piece of paper, the attack that somebody has to engage you with is going to be local. So you might have local threats, but you're not going to have threats from clear across the world, right? So do not ever store physical intellectual property digitally if it's not required, okay? So I point out the rule here is never bring the physical into the digital if it's not required. Now that if it's not required, sometimes you have to, because the physical requires, the physical requires the digital on some level to create it, and that is a challenge. And there are ways to still reduce the risk using like factorial concepts in math, but that requires some pretty advanced thinking in terms of strategy. So one of the stories here, I'm going to change a lot of the details because there's currently an investigation going on with it, but it involves a business that was only a physical business, I should say. So they were only doing business in the physical world, but they decided to create a website with a login page to allow viewers to access, let's say, their information. So we'll pretend for this story's sake that this business was a gold vault, because a gold vault is a physical business fundamentally. They're storing physical gold, they're storing it in a physical vault. So this physical gold vault decided to build a website, and they decided to have a database with all of their customers' information, and they decided to let their customers view all of the gold that they had. Well, let's think about that. They're a physical business. They're dealing with physical resources. There's no reason for them to have a website. So they decide to bring a website, and then they have a database. So what do you think hackers are going to do? Well, hackers went in, and they changed the database records, and they were able to steal gold. And like I said, I'm changing the details of the actual story, but would be the equivalent if a company did this. A physical gold vault is a physical gold vault that stores physical gold. They should not, in any way, shape, or form, have a website, especially with the login page. They should not be doing business digitally. Now, I know a lot of them do. I don't agree with them, and I would never store gold in a digital gold vault, because that's exactly what that is. It's not a physical gold vault. It's a digital gold vault. The second you have a website, the second you have a database, you allow yourself to be attacked in a way that you can't even imagine. So a physical gold vault should only exist in the physical world with physical gold, where people have to physically go in and do business with them. No digital, right? In fact, if I can find you on Google, I would never do business with your gold vault, because Google is very dangerous. Nobody's thinking about it from the security perspective, right? If you're a digital business, that's one thing. But if you're a physical business, in some context, you should not be listed on Google, right? Especially in the gold community, you'll talk to people in the gold community. That's how you'll find out where those vaults are. And by the way, I know a lot of people say, well, but a lot of gold vaults have digital websites or in the digital world. I agree. They don't know what they're doing. I would never do business with any of them. So if you do, don't be surprised if they ever get attacked in that way, because again, they're opening themselves up to digital attacks. They should not. You're a physical business in the physical world. Stay there, right? And that's how you, by the way, get billionaire customers, which is really where the money's at, not the average mom and pop customers. Because the billionaire customers are going to go to the community and ask around. They're not going to be looking through Google. The other one as well is, and this applies to the digital world. So this is one of the digital techniques, but it's much harder in the digital than the physical. And that is to use barrier to entry with physical intellectual property. So it is possible. Microsoft, Amazon, for instance, with their cloud, think about, there's some physical aspects to it. There's also some digital aspects to it. It's going to be really hard to compete with both of those, right? It's possible, but it's going to be harder to compete with Amazon's digital web presence. So again, it's not impossible, but you're going to have to focus on probably one niche in order to compete. And when it comes to hacking, it's going to be much harder to do. Again, it's possible, but much harder to do. When it comes to the physical world, though, this is very effective. And one of the best examples of this was, I went to this one Amish event, I should say, where the Amish were teaching local communities how to farm, how to do beekeeping, how to manufacture goods. And one of the things that I walked away with was realizing that one of the brilliances of the Amish's, their business system, was barrier to entry. And one of the classes I took really demonstrated this well. It was a beekeeping class. And everybody in the audience told me that they wanted to be beekeepers as I was talking to them. Well, when the Amish guy got up and started to explain the beekeeping business, there was this one lady who asked, "Do you ever get stung by bees?" And he said, "Oh yeah, about 5 to 10 times a day." And that was the moment that pretty much everybody in the audience was like, "No, we don't want to be beekeepers." And it was because of this simple concept called barrier to entry. The thought of being stung by a bee was too much for most people to handle. And so that is the brilliance of the Amish system. They are willing to do the work that people don't want to do. And so if you're, let's say, a thief in the physical world, the thief is what you have to be worried about. Like, what would you actually steal? Would you steal the bees? But then you're going to have to do the work, right? So if you steal their honey, but the problem is you haven't earned the reputation of being Amish to then sell the honey. So no matter what a thief steals in the Amish's world, there's going to be work to do. And there's always somebody out there who's not willing to do that work that's an easier target. And so essentially that barrier to entry prevents that physical intellectual property from being compromised. It's not that people are unaware of what they're doing. It's that what they're doing requires a lot of work, and nobody wants to do that. So these techniques will significantly reduce or eliminate theft of intellectual property if you practice them. Again, they only apply in some cases because there are a lot of businesses that are digital that are not physical, or there are some businesses that are physical but they do need a digital presence, and you have to think about whether that applies to you or not. So when we talk about the digital world, we want to think about the design of how we typically develop, let's say, software or any type of technical project generally when it comes to the digital world. And that is, we have a cycle of generally development first, then quality assurance. We're looking to see with testing whether what we've developed works. Then we have a kind of a pre-production environment, and then we have a production environment. This is generally the cycle, okay? So in development, we're just building things, testing them in development, and then we're rolling it out to QA where we test the functional, the security, and the performance of whatever it is that we're developing. Pre-production, generally about 1 to 5% of our customers have access to this pre-production. They may get a discount, they may get the newest features, which is what they may want, but there's going to be potentially bugs here. And then of course, production is all of our customers. This is generally the development cycle. Now, there are derivatives of this, but this is generally what we see. There's not always 4 environments. Sometimes there's 3, sometimes there's 10. So they break these down even more specifically. But generally, this is what we see. What we have to ask ourselves with this development cycle, is this the best cycle to use when we talk about intellectual property? So one thing I highlight here is that an alternative design is to not actually use the full development cycle, and that is to eliminate development in QA and just develop directly into pre-production and production. So a story that I heard related to this was an artificial intelligence engine used in gaming. Well, they didn't want people to have access to this. This was their intellectual property. So they did not allow people in development or QA to have access to that artificial intelligence engine. So when was it deployed? In pre-production, and it was very strict about who had access, and in production. And so that's a great example where they skipped these 2 cycles. Part of that was because it was developed in a way, all of the development, I should say, on other pieces of the game were developed where they would pass in parameters. They didn't understand what was going on with those parameters, but they would pass in parameters to that AI engine, which would in turn do something. So the AI engine didn't need to be redeveloped. It was something that was developed in a way that they could reuse. And if you think about it, that occurs a lot with, let's say, some DLL libraries that haven't been updated in years. And the reason is because they were built in a way that accepts certain parameters and then outputs data a certain way, and so they don't need to be redeveloped again. So there are a lot of examples of this, but essentially the intellectual property is designed and rolled out differently than the rest of our environment. And so we have to think about, and we'll discuss next, which is talent related to the digital world. But keep in mind that this software development cycle, this development cycle in general, may not be appropriate in intellectual property. So one of the techniques that we can use here in the digital world is to review our development cycle. So one of the things that we're not going to discuss because it would take too long, I could teach a college course on this, and even one college course wouldn't even be enough, but that is talent. And there are many myths, and in fact some of the security myths related to a talent that I'm going to address really quickly is myth number 1, which is we can avoid trust. And I'll get into myth number 2, which relates to this. But the idea is we don't have to trust people, and it could be we can just replace it with technology, or it could be we can just trust these type of people or whatnot, or we can outsource it or whatnot. This is wrong because there's going to be trust required with everything, right? And ultimately, if we have employees that, even if they give a little bit of information, it gives clues to attackers what to go after, right? So on some level, we do have to trust, okay? That's just the reality. But we can verify that trust, right? So that's key. We're not going to be able to avoid trusting, but we can verify. And one of my favorite quotes, I think it's by Ronald Reagan, but it may be somebody else who originally said it, which is trust but verify, right? Don't assume what people are telling you is correct. People may or may not be telling you the truth. So verify whether they're telling you the truth, right? So trust but verify. That's a good principle in security. The myth number 2, which is related to this, was like we don't have to trust anybody. We'll just use artificial intelligence. Wherever there is input, there is an injection risk. That applies to AI, that applies to databases, that applies to configuration files, that applies to any type of key vault situation. It applies to everything. Where there is input, there is injection risks, okay? And what I find funny about this, and it's almost like the lazy way of thinking is we'll just use AI to protect us, is that first of all, they're forgetting that hackers can use AI just like you can. And for every strategy, there is a counter strategy. But second of all, AI requires input. Okay, just like you as a human require input. And by the way, you as a human can be hacked in ways that if I feed you the wrong information, it can change your behavior, right? Which is what hackers are doing. They're feeding, They're feeding, let's say, a database the wrong information to get the database to engage in behavior that we don't really want it to do, right? They're manipulating that. So anything that allows for input is potentially going to have injection risks, okay? In fact, one of my favorite jokes about NoSQL is you have the people that are like, we're going to use NoSQL because there's NoSQL injection. And the reason why I like that joke is because there's NoSQL injection is a pun, because there's NoSQL injection. And we see an example of this myth that was used by Exactus. They had a blog. In fact, I think they took it down their post. They had a blog post about using artificial intelligence in security. And, security was going to be easy because we were just going to use AI. This, by the way, is a great example of a company that is all about marketing and not about security. Very, very good example. And they had a data breach, right? And turns out AI wasn't quite as effective at securing their environment as they thought. And that's because, again, it has input. So the hacker's going to go after your AI. That's what it's going to go after if, let's say, you were actually using artificial intelligence. So I can assure you that, again, talent is going to be important. And at some point, you're going to have to trust someone or something. And AI may be more complicated than you think. It definitely has its use cases, but you have to be very careful about it. And then, of course, continuing on this topic, demographics, like birth order, may play a huge part of talent regarding security and trust. There are certain birth orders that are more secure than others. Edward Snowden is a great example of somebody who should have never been in his position. There are several factors with Edward Snowden, but one of the big ones is birth order. And the other one is, of course, he was a millennial. Millennials, for instance, don't respect their own privacy, nor others. Would you trust them with anything? I mean, if somebody doesn't respect their own privacy and they don't respect the privacy of others, I don't know if I would trust them with anything, right? So that's what I'm saying about Edward Snowden is there were a lot of factors about Snowden that the position that he was in. I mean, maybe I would have hired him as an analyst or something, but I would have given him very, very strict assignments that didn't give him very much permission, right? And a lot of people don't know this stuff, right? This is huge. Again, I could teach a whole college course alone on demographics regarding security and trust. Right? It's a deep topic. But millennials especially, I spent years studying millennials and iGens, and the pattern of these two generations is they don't respect their own privacy at all, and they don't respect the privacy of others. And they're the last people I would trust with any information. So you have to be very careful how you provide information to them. So for me personally, it only takes me about 10 seconds of a resume review to see if somebody is qualified for security. The related example of this, and some of you have seen this probably with resumes, I used to do hiring myself, and one of the things that you'd see on resumes from time to time is people would say, I'm creative, or they would list being creative as a skill. It's like if you list it as a skill, then you're not creative because you show your creativity. You don't talk about it. And the same thing with security. You show that you're good at security. You don't talk about it. By the way, keep in mind, this applies to companies as well. Go to any company webpage, or a company website, I should say, and go to like Now Hiring or Careers or any of that and look at how much detail they post about these positions. And a story that occurred with me on this is about 6 or 7 years ago. I had a recruiter that called me and they were interviewing me about a position, but they were trying to get information about past work I had done. And I used to on LinkedIn, which was a mistake, and I realized it was a mistake. I used to list a lot of my past experience. Now I only list the most recent, which is smart. But one of the things that I realized during the call, it became very clear, was it seemed like this recruiter was trying to get information about intellectual property of a past company that I worked at. And so, because all my calls are recorded, I live in Texas and that's legal to do, I reviewed that call with a friend of mine who worked in security. And she pointed out that that person could have either been a dumb recruiter who was just nosy. That's always a possibility, by the way. It could have also been a competitor who was pretending to hire for a position, or it could have been an attacker who wanted to know about intellectual property to compromise the environment. And again, I'm being very vague intentionally. Well, keep in mind that a person can pretend to be a recruiter because companies list these positions on their website. And it becomes very difficult to know if you're receiving that call, if a person is legitimate or not. So this is what I mean by talent on both the acquisition and talent as far as how you're trying to get talent. And like I said, I could deep dive on this all day long, and it would be more than a college course before it's over with. And so neither companies nor people are really considering security when they're going around talking about what they're doing or talking about what they need. And man, I would be having security staff review some of those positions like, is this a smart thing to do? And you can tell they don't. So the other two techniques involve data. So sometimes our intellectual property, when we go back to this development cycle here, our intellectual property, and this is predominantly what we're talking about, is some type of design, right? So let's think of it as an algorithm. We're developing this algorithm through environments, and that might not be the best thing to do, right? But what happens if our intellectual property is data? A little bit more challenging. So at the basis, when it comes to if our intellectual property is data, we want to encrypt data. Now I'm using the example here of a database. So we're storing our data in a database right here. So we encrypt the data at rest. We're going to encrypt it when we're communicating it with the client. This is the end user. And then of course, we're going to encrypt it when it comes to backing up the data. Now keep this in mind. Where do you think a hacker is going to attack, right? Okay. So all forms of data on our end, this is our end, the backups, the database, and then the communication to the client must be encrypted and managed carefully, right? But where do you think a hacker is going to go after? Well, they're going to go after the end user, right? So the technique that we're going to use here, number 2, is we're going to provide users with the least amount of data required for tasks, okay? So a simple example of this is when you pull up, let's say, your bank account online, you should not ever have it return their social security number. You really shouldn't have it return their address. You shouldn't have it return their cell phone number. You should not return their personal information, right? So a user, in fact, and again, if I were to log into most banks, they're violating this. You should never be able to see your personal information if you log into your bank account. That's returning more information. The person is probably doing what? Just looking at their balance, right? Not only that, but if a person wanted to update their address, I would tell them, okay, verify your current address before letting them update that, right? And again, how many banks practice that? Another great example of this, by the way, and it's very sad and unfortunate, but a lot of websites, this is just a basic penetration test that most companies unfortunately fail. Go to a website, enter an email, and then enter a password, just any email, and enter a password. And by the way, do this with your own email. Do not do this with somebody else's because it's considered hacking if you do it with anybody else's email. But do it with your email. And one of the things that you may get from the website or a bank is it may say, we don't have a user with that email. Now think about what I know as a hacker right in that moment. I know that that user does not have an account with that bank. What that means in inverse is I can just go through and start entering emails and try to find out who does have an account with that bank or that website. This is a basic penetration test that a lot of companies fail. So I can find out who is a customer and who is not very quickly. That's very dangerous. What that is providing more information. If you ever design a form like that, the way to design it is when they enter an email and a password, if there's no user there, what you do is you just send a generic message saying, we'll send you an email if you forgot your password. What does that mean? Well, the hacker doesn't know whether there's an account there or not, right? They have no idea. You do that with everyone, even if there's no account. And then, of course, another recommendation is to send an email to the person who, let's say, doesn't have an account at the company and say, hey, somebody tried to use your email to log in. We just want to let you know you don't have an account with us. And that's because you're alerting that person that somebody is using their email maliciously. But that is something that is very basic that some companies are providing more data. When you enter an email address that's not affiliated with the company, they're letting you know that when you try to do the forgot password, right? So be careful. That's a great example of giving users more data than they need. Users don't need that information, right? If a user accidentally enters the wrong email address, which is how I discovered this one time, I entered my email address wrong and it said there's no email address with our company, or we don't have a email address on file with that name or whatnot. And I thought you would never want to say that if that was true. and yet the company was providing more information. So it's the same thing with users. If I log into a bank account and I want to get my balance, provide the least amount of information, especially about users' PII. But go ahead, do it. Log into your bank and look at how easy it is to get all your information. It's amazing. It's just terrible security. So this is a two-technique combination of encryption plus least information, given that attackers will always go after the easiest target first. Why? Who do you think they're going to go after in this picture? Well, I mean, encryption, don't assume it's impossible to get around. There may be intelligence agencies like the Chinese MSS who can get around it. Maybe, maybe not. We don't know. I will tell you one thing about the Chinese MSS as they've proven. If they do have technology, you won't know about it because they're very good at keeping secrets. Maybe some of the other intelligence agencies are not, but the Chinese MSS for sure is. So if they have already broken encryption, you would never know. But that's a pretty big target, and that may not be a target you have to worry about or an attacker that you have to worry about. So most of the attackers are probably going to go after the user, assuming that users want the easiest access. Okay. And then, of course, one of the things, there is a technique that I've developed in speaking of intellectual property, and you can reach out to me on YouTube using the YouTube, About page, and I'll put you in touch with the team. There are a couple of stipulations about this. This combination that I use is built on top of this. So this is a combination that everybody should already be using. So if you're not using this already, hate to say this, not going to work with you because you're already at risk. But if you're already using this technique, then there is another technique that I build on top of it that's even more effective. But I will say one thing, you have to be, first of all, following this practice. And number two, your firm is not practicing poor security like Exactus. I'm going to tell you right now, by the way, I'm going to go read your blog and I'm going to go read your Now Hiring page or your careers page. And those are two things. I will not do business with you if you're practicing poor security with your blog like Exactus or with your Now Hiring page. It's just, you're already at risk for an attack, and you have to at some point, for instance, if you identify who your clients are, that's a risk. You're exposing your clients to now risks, right? You never do that. You never tell people who you work with, right? Again, you have to put marketing on the back burner and put security forward, especially in today's world. So just as a review of what we've covered the who of who needs to be involved with intellectual property. We've covered the what is intellectual property, what is intellectual property theft. We've covered the why would somebody steal it. We've also discussed two techniques to protect physical intellectual property. There are some of you that this will apply. Some of you may not have known, hey, you know what, my business is physical and I shouldn't do anything in the digital world because I'm only in the physical world, right? Some of you may not have known that before. Some of you may have. And then, of course, we've looked at 4 total techniques in protecting digital intellectual property. So another thing I'm going to point out that in the description, there will be these resources listed. There are, of course, other resources you can look at, but these are the recommended resources that I suggest when it comes to intellectual property as well as intellectual property theft and protection.